Picture yourself standing on the edge of an ancient volcanic island, waves crashing against black rock cliffs, and all around you, birds with beaks of every imaginable shape. Some beaks are thick and powerful, built for cracking seeds. Others are slender and delicate, perfect for plucking insects from crevices. Still others are curved and elongated, specialized for reaching nectar deep within flowers. You're witnessing what might be the most important biological insight in human history, playing out before your eyes. What you're seeing isn't random. It's the signature of a process so powerful, so elegant, so all-encompassing, that one philosopher would later call it a universal acid, eating through every traditional concept we hold dear about life, meaning, and our place in the cosmos. Welcome to Bedtime Biology, where science meets serenity. Each night, we explore the quiet wonders of the natural world, calming your mind and sparking your curiosity. Please like the video, subscribe, and comment below with where you're checking in from. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through one of humanity's most profound intellectual revolutions. We're going to explore Darwin's dangerous idea, the theory of evolution by natural selection. This isn't just another scientific theory. It's a way of understanding life that fundamentally changed how we see ourselves, our origins, and the intricate web of living things that surrounds us. It's an idea that started with careful observation, grew through decades of meticulous research, and ultimately revolutionized biology. Along the way, we'll travel from Victorian England to remote islands, from ancient fossils to modern laboratories, and from tiny genetic mutations to the grand sweep of life's history on Earth. So, settle in, let your mind relax into the rhythm of discovery, and let's begin this peaceful exploration of one of science's greatest ideas, the revolutionary context. To understand why Darwin's idea was so dangerous, so revolutionary, we need to step back in time. Imagine England in the early 19th century, a world vastly different from our own. The year is 1830, and the worldview of most educated people is shaped by centuries of tradition and religious teaching. The dominant understanding of life's diversity comes from natural theology, the idea that the complexity and beauty of nature provides direct evidence of God's design and benevolence. In this world, species are fixed and unchanging, created by divine hand in their present form. The beauty of a butterfly's wing, the precision of an eye, the perfect fit between a flower and its pollinator, all of these are seen as the work of a supreme designer. William Paley's watchmaker argument holds sway over intellectual discourse. Just as finding a watch implies a watchmaker, Paley argued, the intricate mechanisms of living things imply an intelligent creator. This wasn't just religious doctrine, it was considered the most reasonable, scientific explanation for the diversity of life. The Earth itself was thought to be young, perhaps only a few thousand years old, as calculated from biblical genealogies. Archbishop James Ussher had famously dated creation to October 23rd, 4004 BC in the evening. While not everyone accepted this specific date, the general sense of a young Earth pervaded scientific thinking. Mountains, valleys, and the arrangement of rocks and fossils were often explained by catastrophism, the idea that the Earth's features were shaped by sudden, violent events, particularly the biblical flood. But beneath this seemingly stable intellectual landscape, tremors were beginning to shake the foundations. Geologists like Charles Lyell were proposing radical new ideas about the age of the Earth. Lyell's Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833, argued for uniformitarianism, the principle that the same geological processes we observe today have been operating throughout Earth's history. If rivers carve canyons slowly and mountains erode gradually, then the Earth must be immensely old, far older than a few thousand years. Lyell's work suggested an Earth measured not in thousands, but in millions or even billions of years. This deep time was crucial. Without vast stretches of time, there could be no gradual change, no slow transformation of one species into another. The recognition that Earth had an ancient history opened a door, and through that door would eventually walk an idea that would change everything. But that idea needed someone to articulate it clearly, to gather the evidence, and to present it in a way that would convince the scientific world. That someone was Charles Robert Darwin. Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, into a family of wealth and intellectual distinction. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been a physician, natural philosopher, and poet who had written about evolutionary ideas decades earlier, suggesting that all life might have descended from a single ancestor. Young Charles grew up in Shrewsbury, England, showing an early fascination with nature. He collected beetles with passionate enthusiasm, explored the countryside, and developed the keen observational skills that would serve him throughout his life. His father, Robert Darwin, was a successful physician who hoped Charles would follow in his footsteps. Charles dutifully went to Edinburgh University to study medicine, but he found the lectures dull, and the surgical procedures, performed without anesthesia in those days, before modern medicine, utterly horrifying. He couldn't bear to watch suffering, and medicine was not for him. Abandoning medical studies, he transferred to Cambridge University to prepare for life as a clergyman, a respectable career for a gentleman with scientific interests. At Cambridge, Darwin studied theology, but spent much of his time pursuing his passion for natural history. He befriended Professor John Stevens Henslow, a botanist who recognized Darwin's potential and encouraged his scientific interests. They would take long walks together, discussing plants, insects, and the natural world. Henslow became not just a teacher, but a mentor, someone who saw in Darwin a brilliant and careful observer of nature. It was Henslow who would change Darwin's life forever by recommending him for an extraordinary opportunity. In 1831, when Darwin was just 22 years old, he received a letter that would alter the course of history. Captain Robert Fitzroy was preparing HMS Beagle, a small naval vessel, for a voyage to chart the coastline of South America. Fitzroy wanted a naturalist to accompany the expedition, someone who could make scientific observations and collect specimens. More than that, he wanted a gentleman companion, someone of his own social class with whom he could converse during the long months at sea. The position was unpaid, but for someone of Darwin's background, who didn't need to earn a living, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Darwin's father initially objected. He thought it was a waste of time for someone who should be preparing for a career in the church. But Darwin's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, intervened and persuaded Robert Darwin to let his son go. On December 27th, 1831, HMS Beagle set sail from Plymouth, England. Darwin, prone to seasickness and embarking on what was supposed to be a 2-year voyage that would actually last nearly 5 years, had no idea that he was beginning a journey that would revolutionize human thought. The Beagle was a small ship, just 90 feet long, cramped and uncomfortable. Darwin shared a cabin so tiny that he had to remove a drawer to make room for his feet when sleeping. He was often miserably seasick when the ship was at sea. But whenever the Beagle made landfall, Darwin came alive. He would spend weeks or even months exploring the land, collecting specimens, making observations, and filling notebook after notebook with his thoughts and discoveries. The voyage took the Beagle down the coast of South America, across the Pacific to Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia, past the Cocos Islands and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and finally back to England in October 1836. During those 5 years, Darwin underwent a transformation. He began as a young graduate with conventional views about the fixity of species. He would end as a meticulous observer who had seen things that couldn't be explained by the old theories, things that would eventually lead him to question everything he had been taught about the origin and diversity of life. The voyage that changed everything. The voyage of HMS Beagle was more than just a journey through space. It was a journey through time, through layers of geological history that spoke of an ancient Earth, and through ecosystems that whispered secrets about the relationships between living things. From the very beginning of the voyage, Darwin was struck by observations that didn't quite fit with the prevailing worldview. In the Cape Verde Islands, Darwin's first significant stop, he observed bands of white rock embedded with shells, similar to those found on modern beaches, but raised high above sea level. This was evidence that the land had risen, just as Charles Lyell had suggested in his Principles of Geology. Darwin had brought Lyell's book with him, and it became his constant companion, shaping how he interpreted what he saw. If land could rise and fall, if geological processes could reshape the Earth over vast periods of time, what else might be possible? As the Beagle sailed down the coast of South America, Darwin spent months exploring on land, often traveling far inland while the ship continued its surveying work. He was collecting everything: rocks, fossils, plants, insects, birds, reptiles. He packed specimen after specimen into crates and shipped them back to England. In the pampas of Argentina, Darwin made a discovery that would haunt him for years. He found enormous bones, the fossils of extinct mammals that had once roamed South America. There were giant ground sloths, massive armored creatures like oversized armadillos, and bizarre mammals, unlike anything alive today. What struck Darwin was the resemblance between these extinct creatures and the smaller animals still living in South America. The giant fossils seemed to be related to modern species, but on a grander scale. If species were separately created and fixed, why would extinct forms look so similar to living ones in the same region? Why would South America's fossils look like giant versions of South American animals, while fossils in Europe looked like giant versions of European animals? It was a pattern that suggested relationship, connection, change over time. The fossil discoveries continued. In Patagonia, Darwin found more extinct mammals, including the remains of a horse-like creature. But horses had gone extinct in South America thousands of years ago, only to be reintroduced by Spanish conquistadors. Why would a horse-like creature have lived in South America in the distant past, then disappeared, only to thrive again when brought back by humans? The more Darwin collected and observed, the more these questions piled up, creating a growing sense that the old explanations were insufficient. In February 1835, Darwin experienced something that brought home the reality of geological change. He was in Valdivia, Chile, when a massive earthquake struck. He felt the ground shake beneath him, a terrifying experience that lasted several minutes. Later, traveling to the city of Concepcion, he saw the devastation. Buildings had been reduced to rubble. But what fascinated Darwin from a scientific perspective was that the land itself had risen. Beds of mussels and other marine creatures that had been underwater were now sitting above the high tide line, dead and exposed to the air. The earthquake had lifted the coastline several feet in an instant. If a single earthquake could raise the land several feet, what could countless earthquakes do over millions of years? Darwin looked at the towering Andes Mountains and imagined them rising slowly, earthquake by earthquake, through unimaginable stretches of time. High in the mountains, he found fossils of marine shells, proof that rocks now at great elevations had once been at the bottom of the sea. The Earth was dynamic, constantly changing, and far more ancient than anyone had previously imagined. This was the geological theatre in which life's drama had played out. But it was a specific set of islands that would crystallize Darwin's thinking more than any other location. In September 1835, the Beagle reached the Galápagos Islands, a cluster of volcanic islands sitting astride the equator, about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. These islands were young in geological terms, thrust up from the ocean floor by volcanic activity. They were barren, black, and forbidding, covered in volcanic rock and sparse vegetation. Darwin initially found them unappealing, calling them infernal regions in his diary. But what he observed there would change the course of scientific history. The Galápagos were unlike anywhere Darwin had visited. The animals showed little fear of humans, having evolved without large predators. Darwin could walk right up to the giant tortoises that gave the islands their name, tortoises so large that several men were needed to lift one. He observed marine iguanas, the only lizards in the world to make their living in the sea, diving to feed on algae. He saw land iguanas, flightless cormorants with stubby, useless wings, and birds of every description. But it was a casual remark by the vice-governor of the islands, Nicholas Lawson, that planted a seed in Darwin's mind. Lawson told Darwin that he could tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. Tortoises from islands with lush vegetation had dome-shaped shells and short necks. Tortoises from drier islands with tall cacti had saddle-shaped shells and longer necks, allowing them to reach up to browse on cactus pads. Different islands, Darwin was learning, had different varieties of tortoises, each seemingly adapted to its particular environment. The same pattern held for mockingbirds. Darwin noticed that mockingbirds on different islands looked similar, but showed consistent differences. He began carefully labeling his specimens by island, something he hadn't been careful about initially. Later, back in England, an ornithologist named John Gould would examine Darwin's bird specimens and make a startling announcement. What Darwin had thought were different types of birds, some finches, some grosbeaks, some blackbirds, were all finches, closely related species that had diverged to fill different ecological roles. These finches, which would later become famous as Darwin's finches, showed remarkable variation in their beaks. Some had large, heavy beaks for cracking tough seeds. Others had small, delicate beaks for eating soft seeds or catching insects. Some had beaks like those of warblers, fine and pointed for gleaning small insects from leaves. Others had beaks like those of woodpeckers, strong for drilling into wood. One species had even learned to use cactus spines as tools to extract insects from crevices, a remarkable example of bird tool use. The pattern was clear, at least in retrospect. These islands were laboratories of evolution. A founding population of finches had somehow reached the islands, perhaps blown from the mainland by a storm. On each island, in the absence of competitors, the finches had diversified to exploit different food sources. Over time, isolated populations on different islands had diverged, developing different beak shapes and sizes suited to different diets. Natural variation had been shaped by the demands of survival, with those individuals best suited to their island's particular resources surviving and reproducing. But Darwin didn't immediately grasp the full significance of what he was seeing. At the time, he was still thinking in terms of the creationist paradigm he had been taught. It was only later, back in England, when he reviewed his notes and specimens, that the pieces began to fall into place. If these finches were all related, descended from a common ancestor, then species were not fixed and unchanging. They could diverge, adapt, transform over time. New species could arise from old ones. The Galápagos observations would become central to Darwin's theory, though he would spend years working out the mechanism by which such change could occur. The voyage home gave Darwin time to think. He examined coral reefs in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, developing a theory about how atolls form as volcanic islands slowly sink, with corals building upward to stay near the surface. He filled more notebooks with observations and reflections. By the time the Beagle returned to England in October 1836, Darwin had amassed an enormous collection of specimens and a mind full of questions. The voyage had transformed him from a student into a scientist, from someone who accepted conventional wisdom into someone who questioned it at every turn. But he still didn't have a complete theory. He knew that species could vary. He had seen it in the Galápagos, in the patterns of fossils, in the ways animals adapted to different environments. What he didn't yet understand was the mechanism. How did variation arise? Why did some variations persist while others disappeared? What was the process that could transform one species into another over time? The answer would come from an unlikely source, an essay on human population growth by an economist named Thomas Malthus. The core mechanism, natural selection. Back in England, Darwin found himself famous in scientific circles even before he unpacked all his specimens. He had sent crates of material back during the voyage, and his collections had amazed the experts who examined them. He was elected to prestigious scientific societies, befriended leading geologists and naturalists, and began working on describing his finds. He wrote about the geology of South America, about coral reefs, about barnacles, which would occupy him for 8 years in a detailed taxonomic study. But in private, in secret notebooks that he kept carefully hidden, Darwin was working on something far more controversial. He was developing a theory of how species change over time. In March 1837, just months after returning from the voyage, Darwin opened what he called his transmutation notebook. Transmutation was the term used, often pejoratively, for the idea that species could transform into other species. In this notebook, Darwin began sketching out ideas about how such transformation might occur. He drew a simple branching diagram, one of the first evolutionary trees, showing how species might diverge from common ancestors over time. He considered various mechanisms that might drive change, from the effects of the environment to the habits and behaviors of animals. But the key insight came in September 1838, when Darwin read An Essay on the Principle of Population by Thomas Malthus. Malthus, an economist and clergyman, had written about human populations, arguing that populations tend to grow geometrically, while food supplies grow only arithmetically. This creates a constant struggle for existence. More individuals are born than can possibly survive given limited resources. The result is competition, hardship, famine, and death. For Darwin, Malthus's essay was a revelation. The struggle for existence wasn't just a human problem. It was a universal feature of life. Every species produces more offspring than can survive to reproduce themselves. A single oak tree might produce thousands of acorns, but how many grow into mature trees? A fish might lay millions of eggs, but how many survive to adulthood? A pair of elephants, Darwin calculated, could have millions of descendants after just a few hundred years if all survived and reproduced. But clearly, the world is not overrun with elephants. Something must prevent unlimited population growth. Some individuals must die before reproducing. Some must fail to find mates. Some must be outcompeted for food or shelter. This struggle for existence was the key. If there was variation among individuals, and if some variations made it more likely for an individual to survive and reproduce, then over time, those advantageous variations would become more common. It was as simple as that, and as profound. Darwin had his mechanism. He called it natural selection, drawing an analogy to the artificial selection practiced by breeders of domestic animals and plants. For centuries, humans had been modifying species through selective breeding. Farmers chose the cows that gave the most milk, the sheep with the finest wool, the dogs with the most useful behaviors, and bred them selectively. Over generations, dramatic changes could be produced. Think of all the varieties of domestic dog, from tiny Chihuahuas to massive Great Danes, all descended from wolves through selective breeding. Natural selection worked the same way, Darwin realized, but without any conscious selector. Nature did the selecting through the simple fact of survival and reproduction. Imagine a population of birds living on an island where the primary food source is seeds. The seeds vary in size and hardness. Some birds, through random variation, are born with slightly larger, stronger beaks. These birds find it easier to crack the toughest seeds, especially during times when food is scarce and only the hardest seeds remain. Because they can access food that other birds cannot, they are more likely to survive through hard times. And because they survive, they are more likely to reproduce and pass their large beak traits to their offspring. Over many generations, this small advantage adds up. The proportion of birds with larger beaks increases in the population. Eventually, the average beak size in the population shifts. If this process continues long enough, and if the population becomes isolated from other populations of the same species, the accumulated changes might be so great that the island birds can no longer interbreed with their mainland cousins. A new species has been born, not through any divine intervention, not through any inherent drive toward complexity, but through the simple, mechanical process of differential survival and reproduction. This is natural selection. It requires just three things to operate. First, there must be variation in the population. individuals must differ from one another in ways that can be inherited. Second, this variation must affect survival or reproduction. Some variations must make it more or less likely that an individual will survive to reproduce. Third, the variation must be heritable. Parents must pass their traits to their offspring so that advantageous variations accumulate over generations. Given these conditions, natural selection is inevitable. It's not a force or an agent. It's a process, an algorithm, a set of simple rules that, when played out over vast periods of time, can produce the spectacular diversity of life we see around us. The beauty of it is its simplicity. There's no need for any guiding hand, no need for predetermined plans or purposes. The appearance of design arises naturally from the interaction of variation, competition, and inheritance. But Darwin knew that his theory would be controversial. It removed humans from any special place in creation, making us just another branch on the tree of life, descended from the same ancestors as apes, as fish, as bacteria. It explained adaptation without reference to a designer, suggesting that the intricate structures of living things arose through a blind, undirected process. And it implied that the struggle for existence, the suffering and death that pervade the natural world were not unfortunate side effects of a fallen world, but the very engine that drives the creation of new forms of life. Darwin sat on his theory for years, developing it, refining it, gathering more and more evidence. He studied barnacles, domestic pigeons, plant breeding, anything that could shed light on how species vary and change. He corresponded with naturalists around the world, asking questions, collecting facts. He wrote out a brief sketch of his theory in 1842, then a longer essay in 1844, but he showed these to only a few trusted friends. He feared the controversy his ideas would unleash, feared the damage to his reputation and to his family. His wife, Emma, was deeply religious, and Darwin worried that his theory would cause her pain. Then, in June 1858, Darwin received a letter that forced his hand. Alfred Russel Wallace, a younger naturalist who was collecting specimens in the Malay archipelago, had independently arrived at the same theory. Wallace had been struck by the struggle for existence during a bout of malaria, and in a flash of insight had worked out the principle of natural selection. He wrote it up in a brief essay and sent it to Darwin, asking Darwin to forward it to a prominent scientist for possible publication. Darwin was stunned. 20 years of work, and someone else had beaten him to publication. But Darwin's friends, the geologist Charles Lyell and the botanist Joseph Hooker, arranged a solution. They would present papers by both Darwin and Wallace to the Linnean Society, establishing priority for both men as co-discoverers of the principle. This happened on July 1st, 1858. The presentation caused barely a ripple at the time, but it spurred Darwin to finally write the book that would change the world. Working at tremendous speed, Darwin condensed decades of research into a single volume. He called it On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It was published on November 24th, 1859, and it sold out on the first day. The book laid out Darwin's theory with meticulous care, supporting it with example after example from nature and from domestic breeding. It was cautious in tone, acknowledging difficulties and anticipating objections, but it was revolutionary in content. Darwin began with variation, showing how all domestic species and wild species show variation among individuals. He discussed how breeders select for desired traits, producing remarkable changes in just a few generations. Then, he introduced the concept of the struggle for existence, drawing on Malthus to show that all species produce more offspring than can survive. Given variation and a struggle for existence, natural selection followed inevitably. Individuals with advantageous variations would be more likely to survive and reproduce, passing those variations to their offspring. Over time, this would lead to gradual modification of species. The book discussed many lines of evidence supporting evolution, the geographical distribution of species, with related forms found near each other rather than scattered randomly around the globe. The patterns seen in embryological development, with embryos of very different animals showing striking similarities. The existence of vestigial organs, structures that serve no apparent purpose, but make sense as remnants of features that were functional in ancestors. The classification of living things into nested hierarchies, which makes sense if species are related by common descent, but is puzzling if each species was separately created. Darwin devoted an entire chapter to difficulties with the theory, honestly addressing the problems and objections he anticipated. How could something as complex as an eye evolve through gradual steps? Why are there gaps in the fossil record? How can we explain the evolution of sterile worker castes in social insects? Darwin tackled each problem, showing how it might be addressed, even if complete answers weren't yet available. The Origin of Species was a masterpiece of scientific argument, but it was also a work of natural history filled with vivid examples and careful observations. Darwin wrote about orchids and their insect pollinators, about the dispersal of seeds, about the instincts of bees and the social structures of ants. He wrote with passion and clarity, making complex ideas accessible to educated readers. And he wrote with caution, barely touching on the most explosive implication of his theory, that humans too had evolved from earlier forms of life. The reaction was immediate and intense. Scientists, clerics, and the educated public debated Darwin's theory with fervour. Some embraced it enthusiastically, seeing in it a powerful explanation for the diversity of life. Others rejected it vehemently, finding it offensive to their religious beliefs or scientifically inadequate. The debates raged in scientific journals, in the popular press, and in public forums. In a famous confrontation at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1860, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce mocked the theory, supposedly asking biologist Thomas Henry Huxley whether he was descended from an ape on his grandmother's or grandfather's side. Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog for his fierce defense of evolution, replied that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his intellect to obscure the truth. Over time, the scientific community came to accept evolution as a fact. Species were not fixed and unchanging. They evolved, descended from common ancestors, diversifying and adapting over time. The evidence became overwhelming, from fossils to genetics to molecular biology. But the acceptance of natural selection as the primary mechanism of evolution took longer. For decades, scientists proposed alternative mechanisms, some arguing for directed variation or inherent tendencies toward complexity. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s, with the modern synthesis that united Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics, that natural selection regained its central place in evolutionary theory. Today, natural selection is recognized as the dominant mechanism driving adaptive evolution. It's been observed in action in countless studies, from bacteria evolving antibiotic resistance in laboratories, to birds adapting to changing climates, to fish evolving in response to predation pressure. The theory has been refined and expanded, incorporating knowledge of genetics, development, and molecular biology that Darwin never dreamed of. But the core insight remains: the elegant, powerful, dangerous idea that life's diversity and apparent design can arise through a simple, undirected process operating over vast stretches of time. The evidence mounts. One of the most powerful aspects of Darwin's theory is that it makes predictions. If life has evolved through descent, with modification from common ancestors, we should see certain patterns in nature. We should find fossils showing intermediate forms between major groups of organisms. We should see similarities in the anatomy of related species. We should observe geographical patterns in the distribution of species that reflect their evolutionary history. And indeed, this is exactly what we find. The evidence for evolution has accumulated over the past century and a half, until it has become one of the most thoroughly supported theories in all of science. The fossil record, despite its imperfections, provides some of the most dramatic evidence for evolution. Fossils are the preserved remains or traces of organisms that lived in the past, typically found in sedimentary rocks that form layers over time. These layers, or strata, provide a chronological record of life's history. The deeper the layer, the older the fossils it contains. When we examine fossils from different time periods, we see a clear pattern. The oldest rocks contain only simple, single-celled organisms. As we move forward in time, more complex forms appear. The first multicellular animals emerge about 600 million years ago. The first vertebrates, animals with backbones, appear about 500 million years ago. The first land plants and animals appear about 450 million years ago. Dinosaurs dominate from about 230 million years ago until their extinction 66 million years ago. Mammals diversify and become dominant only after the dinosaurs' demise. This pattern of increasing complexity and diversity over time is exactly what we would expect if life evolved, gradually from simple ancestors. But it's not just the overall pattern that supports evolution. We also find fossils that show intermediate characteristics between major groups, transitional forms that document evolution in action. These fossils are sometimes called missing links, though that term is misleading because they're not missing at all. We have many of them, and more are discovered regularly. Consider the transition from fish to land-dwelling tetrapods, animals with 4 legs. This was one of the most important events in vertebrate evolution, opening up terrestrial environments to vertebrate life. For a long time, we had fish fossils from the Devonian period, about 400 million years ago, and we had fossils of early tetrapods from slightly later. But there was a gap. What did the intermediate forms look like? How did fins transform into legs? In recent decades, paleontologists have discovered a series of fossils that fill in this transition beautifully. Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic in 2004, is perhaps the most famous. Tiktaalik lived about 375 million years ago. It had gills and scales like a fish, but it also had a neck, something no fish has, allowing it to move its head independently of its body. Its fins had bones and joints similar to those in our arms and legs, capable of supporting the animal's weight. Tiktaalik was adapted for living in shallow water, perhaps crawling along the bottom, or even venturing onto land. It's a perfect intermediate, showing how fins could have evolved into limbs through gradual modification. Or consider the evolution of whales, which has been documented in spectacular detail through fossils found in Pakistan and Egypt. Modern whales are fully aquatic mammals, superbly adapted for life in the ocean. They have flippers instead of front legs, no hind legs at all, a tail fluke for propulsion, and a blowhole on top of their heads for breathing. How did such creatures evolve from land-dwelling mammals? The fossil record provides the answer. About 50 million years ago, there lived a wolf-sized mammal called Pakicetus. It had long legs and was clearly adapted for walking on land, but certain features of its skull and ears linked it to modern whales. Pakicetus probably spent time near water, perhaps wading and catching fish. Over the next 10 million years, we see a series of fossils showing the gradual transition to aquatic life. Ambulocetus, whose name means walking whale, had shorter legs and a more powerful tail, adapted for swimming but still capable of walking on land. Rhodhocetus had even shorter legs and a tail adapted for swimming. Its nostrils were moving backward on its skull toward the position of the blowhole. By the time we reach Dorudon and Basilosaurus, about 40 million years ago, we have fully aquatic whales with tiny vestigial hind legs hidden inside their bodies. This sequence of fossils documents not just the transition from land to sea, but the gradual modification of almost every part of the body. Legs become flippers. The tail develops a fluke. The nostrils migrate to the top of the head. The shape of the skull changes. The teeth, which were differentiated in the early forms as they are in most mammals, become uniform, as in modern toothed whales. Each step in the transition makes sense as an adaptation to increasingly aquatic life, and the fossils show these adaptations accumulating over millions of years. The evolution of horses provides another well-documented sequence. The earliest horses, like Eohippus from about 55 million years ago, were small, about the size of a dog, with 4 toes on their front feet and 3 on their back feet. They lived in forests and browsed on leaves. Over tens of millions of years, as grasslands spread and forests shrank, horses evolved to exploit these new environments. They became larger, developing long legs for running from predators on open plains. Their teeth changed, becoming high-crowned and suited for grinding tough grasses. And their toes were reduced, with the central toe becoming enlarged and eventually forming the hoof of modern horses. The fossil record shows this transition in beautiful detail, with intermediate forms showing 3 toes, then a large central toe with smaller side toes, then, finally, the single-toed modern horse. Birds provide another striking example. The origin of birds from dinosaurs was once controversial, but it's now supported by overwhelming evidence from fossils. The most famous transitional fossil is Archaeopteryx, discovered in Germany in 1861, just 2 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species. Archaeopteryx lived about 150 million years ago, and it had a strange mix of features. It had feathers, a wishbone, and wings like a bird. But it also had teeth, claws on its wings, a long bony tail, and a skeleton very similar to small theropod dinosaurs like Velociraptor. Since the discovery of Archaeopteryx, dozens of feathered dinosaurs have been found, especially in China. These fossils show that feathers originally evolved not for flight, but for insulation or display. Many small dinosaurs were covered in simple, hair-like feathers. Others had more complex, pennaceous feathers, similar to those of modern birds, but on animals that clearly couldn't fly. Flight feathers evolved gradually, perhaps first being used for gliding or for flapping to help the animals run up inclines. Only later did powered flight evolve. The fossil record documents this transition step by step, blurring the line between dinosaurs and birds until the distinction becomes arbitrary. Birds are dinosaurs, the descendants of small theropods that took to the air and survived the mass extinction that wiped out their larger relatives 66 million years ago. These are just a few examples, but the fossil record contains countless transitional forms. We have fossils showing the transition from reptiles to mammals, with forms that had a double jaw joint, one set of bones that became the mammalian jaw, and another that became bones in the middle ear. We have fossils documenting the evolution of elephants from small pig-like ancestors. We have fossils showing the evolution of many features, from feathers to flowers to the shells of mollusks. Each fossil discovery adds to our understanding of life's history, and the overall pattern consistently supports evolution. But fossils aren't the only evidence. Comparative anatomy reveals striking patterns that make sense only in light of evolution. Consider the forelimbs of vertebrates. Whether we look at a human arm, a whale's flipper, a bat's wing, a horse's leg, or a bird's wing, we see the same basic bone structure. There's a single upper bone, the humerus, two lower bones, the radius and ulna, a cluster of wrist bones, and 5 digits. The proportions vary. Some bones are elongated or reduced, but the fundamental pattern is the same. This is called homology, similarity due to shared ancestry. Why would animals with such different lifestyles, flying, swimming, running, grasping, all have the same basic limb structure? From a design perspective, it seems inefficient. Surely a designer could create limbs perfectly suited to each purpose without being constrained by a common pattern. But from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. All these animals inherited their basic limb structure from a common ancestor. Then, natural selection modified that structure for different purposes. Evolution works with what already exists, tinkering and modifying, rather than creating from scratch. Vestigial structures provide even more compelling evidence. These are features that serve little or no function, but make perfect sense as remnants of structures that were functional in ancestors. Why do whales have tiny hip bones, and sometimes even tiny leg bones, buried deep inside their bodies, completely detached from the rest of the skeleton? Because whales evolved from land mammals that had hips and legs. The genes for making legs are still in the whale genome, and sometimes they're partially expressed during development, producing rudimentary structures that have no function. Why do flightless birds like ostriches and emus have wings that are too small for flight? Because they evolved from ancestors that could fly, and though flight has been lost, the wings remain. Why do cave-dwelling fish have eyes that don't work, or no eyes at all? Because they evolved from sighted ancestors, but in the perpetual darkness of caves, eyes provide no advantage and may even be a liability, using up energy and being vulnerable to damage. Natural selection stops maintaining structures that serve no function, and over time they degrade or disappear. Human beings are full of vestigial features. We have tailbones, remnants of the tails our ancestors had. We have wisdom teeth that often don't fit properly in our jaws, because our jaws have become smaller over evolutionary time. We have muscles for wiggling our ears that most people can't consciously control. We have an appendix, a small pouch off the intestine that serves little function and is prone to infection. We have goosebumps, a reflex that made our ancestors' fur stand on end to provide insulation or make them look larger to threats, but which does nothing useful now that we're mostly hairless. Each of these features is a mark of our evolutionary history, a sign that we're modified versions of earlier forms rather than perfect creations designed from scratch. Embryological development provides yet another line of evidence. Embryos of very different animals often look remarkably similar in early stages of development, only diverging later. Human embryos, for instance, go through stages where they have gill slits like fish embryos, even though we never develop functional gills. We have a tail that's prominent in early development, but is mostly reabsorbed before birth. These similarities reflect shared ancestry. The developmental programs that build animals are ancient and highly conserved. Evolution modifies development, adding new stages or changing the timing of events, but it can't completely rewrite the program. The result is that early embryos of related animals look similar, bearing the traces of their common origin. The geographical distribution of species provides powerful evidence for evolution. Species aren't distributed randomly around the globe. Related species tend to be found near each other, with the most closely related species in adjacent regions. This makes sense if species arise through the splitting of ancestral populations, with new species forming when populations become isolated. Oceanic islands are especially telling. Islands never have native land mammals except bats, which can fly there, and occasional species that rafted on vegetation. But islands do have unique species of birds, reptiles, and insects that are found nowhere else. These species are closely related to species on the nearest mainland, showing that they arrived from the mainland and then diversified in isolation. The Galápagos finches are a perfect example. All 13 species of Darwin's finches are found only on the Galápagos Islands and the nearby Cocos Island. They're all closely related to each other and to a species of finch on the South American mainland. This pattern makes sense if a founding population of finches reached the islands and then diversified to exploit different food sources on different islands. It would be very strange if a creator separately made 13 similar but distinct species of finch, put them only on these remote islands, and made them all most similar to a mainland species found 600 miles away. But it's exactly what we'd expect from evolution. All these lines of evidence, fossils, comparative anatomy, vestigial structures, embryology, and biogeography point in the same direction. They all support the conclusion that life has evolved through descent with modification from common ancestors. No single piece of evidence is definitive on its own, but together they form an overwhelming case. The patterns we see in nature make perfect sense in light of evolution, and would be deeply puzzling without it. This is why evolution is considered one of the most thoroughly supported theories in all of science, on par with the theory of gravity or the germ theory of disease. From Mendel to the modern synthesis. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was powerful and elegant, but it had a serious problem that Darwin himself recognized. The theory required variation to exist in populations, and it required that advantageous variations be passed from parents to offspring. But Darwin didn't understand the mechanism of heredity. How were traits passed from generation to generation? Why did offspring resemble their parents? And crucially, how was variation maintained in populations? In Darwin's time, the prevailing idea about inheritance was called blending inheritance. People thought that the traits of parents somehow blended in their offspring, like mixing paint. If a tall parent and a short parent had children, the children would be intermediate in height, with the tall and short characteristics blended together. The problem with this idea, which Darwin recognized but couldn't solve, is that it would cause variation to rapidly disappear. If traits blended, then advantageous variations would be diluted in each generation. Imagine a giraffe born with a slightly longer neck, giving it an advantage in reaching high leaves. If it mates with a normal giraffe and their offspring have intermediate necks, and those offspring mate with more normal giraffes, the long neck trait would be diluted within a few generations. Natural selection would have nothing to work with. This was a serious objection to Darwin's theory, one that troubled him throughout his life. He tried various explanations, even proposing his own theory of heredity called pangenesis, but none were satisfactory. The solution to the problem already existed, discovered by a monk growing peas in a monastery garden, but Darwin never knew about it. Gregor Mendel published his groundbreaking work on inheritance in 1866, but it went unnoticed by the scientific community. It wasn't until 1900, 16 years after Mendel's death, and 18 years after Darwin's, that Mendel's work was rediscovered independently by 3 scientists who recognized its importance. Mendel had experimented with pea plants, carefully tracking how traits like seed color, flower color, and plant height were passed from generation to generation. What he discovered revolutionized biology. Traits weren't blended. They were determined by discrete units that we now call genes. These genes came in different versions, which we call alleles. Each parent contributed one allele to their offspring. Some alleles were dominant, masking the effects of other alleles, while some were recessive, only having an effect when 2 copies were present. This explained why variation didn't disappear. If a rare advantageous trait was recessive, it could persist in a population hidden by dominant alleles, ready to appear in offspring when 2 carriers mated. Even if a trait was dominant, it didn't blend away. It remained a discrete unit, passed intact from generation to generation. Mendel's laws of inheritance provided exactly what Darwin's theory needed, a mechanism to maintain and transmit variation. But initially, many scientists saw Mendelian genetics as contradicting Darwinian evolution rather than supporting it. Mendel had studied traits that came in discrete forms, yellow or green peas, tall or short plants. But Darwin had emphasized continuous variation, traits like height in humans or beak size in birds that vary smoothly rather than in discrete categories. How could Mendelian genetics explain continuous variation? And Mendel's work suggested that new variants appeared suddenly as mutations, which some scientists interpreted as supporting a saltationist view of evolution. The idea that new species could arise in single large jumps, rather than through gradual change. For several decades in the early 20th century, there was tension between Mendelians, who focused on discrete genetic variation, and biometricians, who focused on continuous variation and believed in gradual evolutionary change. The resolution came through the work of mathematical population geneticists in the 1920s and 30s. Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewall Wright, working independently, showed that Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolution were perfectly compatible. The key insight was that continuous variation could be explained by many genes, each with a small effect. Height in humans, for instance, isn't controlled by a single gene, but by hundreds of genes, each contributing a tiny amount. When you have many genes affecting a trait, with each gene coming in different alleles, you get a continuous distribution of phenotypes, even though each gene follows Mendelian rules. This is called polygenic inheritance, and it explains how traits can vary continuously while being inherited in a particulate Mendelian fashion. Fisher, Haldane, and Wright developed mathematical models showing how gene frequencies would change in populations under various conditions. They showed that natural selection, even if it favored only slight differences between individuals, could drive significant evolutionary change over time, given sufficient generations. They incorporated mutation, which introduces new genetic variation, genetic drift, which causes random changes in gene frequencies, especially in small populations, and gene flow, which occurs when individuals migrate between populations. They showed that evolution wasn't just a vague idea about change over time. It was a process that could be precisely modeled and quantified, a change in gene frequencies in populations over time. This theoretical work laid the foundation for what became known as the modern synthesis, the union of Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics that occurred in the 1930s and 40s. The synthesis was the work of many scientists who brought together different fields of biology. Theodosius Dobzhansky, a geneticist who studied fruit flies, showed how genetic variation existed in natural populations and how it was shaped by natural selection and genetic drift. Ernst Mayr, a zoologist who studied birds, developed the biological species concept and explored how new species form through geographic isolation and reproductive barriers. George Gaylord Simpson, a paleontologist, showed how the patterns seen in the fossil record were consistent with the genetic mechanisms of evolution. G. Ledyard Stebbins extended the synthesis to plants, showing how polyploidy, the duplication of entire genomes, played an important role in plant evolution. The modern synthesis established several key principles that remain central to evolutionary biology today. Evolution is defined as a change in gene frequencies in populations over time. The genetic variation that natural selection acts on comes primarily from mutation and recombination during sexual reproduction. Natural selection is the primary mechanism that drives adaptive evolution, the evolution of traits that enhance survival and reproduction. But other mechanisms, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutation, also contribute to evolutionary change, especially for traits that don't affect fitness. Evolution is usually gradual, occurring through the accumulation of many small changes over many generations, though the rate can vary. The synthesis also clarified the relationship between microevolution, small-scale changes within species, and macroevolution, large-scale changes like the origin of new species or major evolutionary transitions. Some had argued that macroevolution required mechanisms beyond those that produced microevolution. But the modern synthesis showed that microevolution and macroevolution are connected. The same mechanisms that cause small changes within populations, when given enough time, and often combined with geographic isolation or ecological specialization, can lead to the origin of new species and the evolution of major new features. Since the modern synthesis, our understanding of genetics has deepened enormously. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick, building on the work of Rosalind Franklin and others, discovered the structure of DNA, the double helix that carries genetic information. This discovery opened up molecular biology and allowed us to study heredity and evolution at the level of DNA sequences. We now know that genes are stretches of DNA that code for proteins or functional RNA molecules. Mutations are changes in the DNA sequence, ranging from the substitution of a single nucleotide to the duplication or deletion of entire genes or chromosomes. We've sequenced the genomes of thousands of species, from bacteria to elephants to humans, and these genomes provide an incredibly detailed record of evolutionary history. We can compare DNA sequences between species and see exactly which genes they share and how those genes have changed over time. The similarities are striking. All life on Earth uses the same genetic code, the same system for translating DNA sequences into proteins. This is powerful evidence that all life shares a common ancestor. If life had arisen independently multiple times, we'd expect different genetic codes, different biochemical systems. But instead, we see universal similarities at the molecular level, exactly what we'd expect if all life is related by descent. Molecular clocks, based on the steady accumulation of mutations over time, allow us to estimate when different lineages diverged from common ancestors. These molecular estimates are generally consistent with dates from the fossil record, providing independent confirmation of evolutionary timelines. We can construct evolutionary trees, phylogenies, based entirely on molecular data, and they match remarkably well with trees based on anatomy or fossils. The tree of life revealed by DNA is essentially the same as the tree revealed by other evidence, a powerful demonstration that we're uncovering real evolutionary relationships. Modern genetics has also revealed surprising complexity. We now know that much of our genome consists of regulatory sequences that control when and where genes are expressed. Small changes in these regulatory regions can have large effects on development and morphology, providing a mechanism for rapid evolutionary change. We know that genes can be duplicated, with one copy retaining its original function, while the other is free to evolve new functions. We know that entire genomes can be duplicated, especially in plants, creating new genetic raw material for evolution to work with. We know that segments of DNA can move around the genome, sometimes inserting into new locations and altering gene function. And we know that evolution can happen through changes, not just in the genes themselves, but in how they're regulated and combined during development. All of this has enriched our understanding of evolution without changing its fundamental principles. Natural selection remains the primary mechanism driving adaptive evolution. The genetic variation that selection acts on comes from mutation and recombination. Evolution occurs through changes in gene frequencies in populations over time. The modern synthesis, refined and expanded by molecular biology, genomics, and developmental biology, provides a comprehensive framework for understanding life's diversity and history. It's a framework that has been tested and confirmed by countless studies, making evolution one of the most robust and productive theories in science. Natural selection in action. One of the most powerful responses to those who doubt evolution is to point to cases where we've actually observed it happening. Natural selection isn't just a historical process that operated in the distant past. It's happening right now, all around us, and in some cases, we can watch it unfold in real time. These examples of evolution in action provide direct evidence for the power of natural selection and show how quickly populations can adapt when selection pressures are strong. Perhaps the most famous example is the peppered moth in England. Before the Industrial Revolution, peppered moths were typically light-coloured with dark speckles, a pattern that camouflaged them against lichen-covered tree bark. The moths rest on tree trunks during the day, and birds hunt them by sight. The light coloration helped them avoid predation. But during the Industrial Revolution, as factories belched out coal smoke and pollution covered the countryside, the lichens died and tree trunks became darkened with soot. Against this dark background, the light-coloured moths stood out and were easily seen by birds. A genetic variant that produced dark, nearly black moths existed at low frequency in moth populations. Before industrialization, these dark moths were at a disadvantage because they were conspicuous against light tree bark. But as the trees darkened with pollution, the situation reversed. Now the dark moths were camouflaged while the light moths stood out. The first dark moth was recorded in Manchester in 1848. By 1905, about 98% of moths in industrial areas like Manchester were dark, while populations in rural areas remained light-coloured. This was evolution by natural selection, happening in just a few decades, fast enough for scientists to document. The mechanism was confirmed through careful experiments. In the 1950s, a biologist named Bernard Kettlewell conducted release and recapture experiments. He marked light and dark moths and released them in polluted areas and in unpolluted areas. In polluted areas, he recaptured more dark moths, suggesting they survived better. In unpolluted areas, he recaptured more light moths. He also observed birds eating moths and found they preferentially caught the conspicuous form in each environment. The story seemed complete. Pollution created a new selective pressure, favouring dark moths in polluted areas. Natural selection rapidly changed the composition of moth populations. The peppered moth story became a classic example in biology textbooks, but it also became controversial. Some critics pointed out flaws in Kettlewell's experiments, such as the fact that he released moths on tree trunks during the day, when the moths would normally be resting in the canopy. Others questioned whether the resting behaviour of moths had been accurately described. For a while, some claimed the whole story was fundamentally flawed or even fraudulent. However, more recent research has vindicated the basic story. A long-term study by Michael Majerus, published in 2012, carefully documented that moths do rest on tree trunks, that birds do preferentially prey on conspicuous moths, and that camouflage is indeed the main selective pressure driving the colour change. Moreover, the story has a final chapter that provides even stronger evidence for natural selection. As air pollution regulations took effect in the mid-20th century and the environment became cleaner, the frequency of dark moths began to decline. Trees lost their sooty coating, lichens returned, and light-coloured moths once again had the advantage. By the end of the 20th century, dark moths had become rare in many areas where they had once been dominant. Natural selection, responding to the changing environment, reversed course. The population tracked the environment, adapting and readapting over just a few decades. This is evolution in action, documented in exquisite detail. Another powerful example of natural selection in action comes from the realm of medicine, the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. When antibiotics were first introduced in the 1940s, they seemed like miracle drugs. Diseases that had been killers, like pneumonia, tuberculosis, and infections from wounds, could suddenly be cured with a simple course of pills. But even as antibiotics were first being deployed, scientists warned that bacteria would evolve resistance. And they were right. Bacterial populations are enormous, with billions or trillions of cells. They reproduce rapidly, with generation times measured in minutes or hours, and they have high mutation rates. In any large bacterial population, there will be some cells that, through random mutation, happen to have genes that confer resistance to a particular antibiotic. Maybe the mutation changes the shape of the protein that the antibiotic targets, so the antibiotic no longer binds effectively. Maybe it produces an enzyme that breaks down the antibiotic. Maybe it pumps the antibiotic out of the cell before it can do damage. When antibiotics are absent, these resistant mutants have no advantage. They might even be at a disadvantage if maintaining resistance is costly. But when antibiotics are present, the situation changes dramatically. Susceptible bacteria die, while resistant bacteria survive. If even a single resistant cell survives treatment, it can multiply and give rise to a resistant population. Through natural selection, the composition of the bacterial population shifts from mostly susceptible to mostly resistant in just a few generations. This has happened repeatedly with virtually every antibiotic ever developed. Bacteria have evolved resistance to penicillin, methicillin, vancomycin, and many others. Some strains have evolved resistance to multiple antibiotics, becoming so-called superbugs that are very difficult to treat. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, causes severe infections that are resistant to most common antibiotics. Multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis requires treatment with expensive second-line drugs for much longer periods. The evolution of antibiotic resistance is a serious public health problem, one that threatens to undo the medical advances of the antibiotic era. The mechanisms of resistance evolution are well understood. Resistance genes can arise through mutation, or they can be acquired through horizontal gene transfer, where bacteria exchange genetic material through processes like conjugation. Once resistance genes exist in a population, natural selection ensures their spread whenever antibiotics are used. The more antibiotics are used, the stronger the selection pressure and the faster resistance evolves. This is why doctors now try to prescribe antibiotics more judiciously, and why it's important to complete a full course of treatment to minimize the chance that resistant bacteria survive. Darwin's finches provide yet another example of evolution in action, and remarkably, it's been documented in the same birds that inspired Darwin's theory over a century ago. Starting in 1973, biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant began a long-term study of finches on Daphne Major, a small volcanic island in the Galápagos. They banded every bird, measured their beaks, tracked their survival and reproduction, and documented what seeds were available as food. Over decades, they witnessed evolution happening in real time. In 1977, a severe drought struck the Galápagos. Small, soft seeds became scarce, and the finches had to rely on larger, harder seeds. Finches with larger beaks, better able to crack these tough seeds, survived better than finches with smaller beaks. The grants measured the beaks of finches before and after the drought, and found that the average beak size in the population increased significantly in just one generation. This was directional selection, where a trait shifts in one direction in response to environmental pressure. But the story didn't end there. In 1982 through 1984, El Niño brought heavy rains to the Galápagos. Small, soft seeds became abundant, and now finches with smaller beaks, better at handling small seeds, had an advantage. The average beak size in the population decreased. The grants documented evolution oscillating back and forth as the environment changed, with selection favoring different traits in different years. These changes were heritable, passed from parents to offspring through genetic differences, exactly as Darwin's theory predicts. The grant's work is remarkable for its detail and duration, spanning over 40 years and documenting evolution over multiple generations. It shows that evolution isn't always slow. When selection pressures are strong, significant change can occur in just a few generations. It also shows that evolution is responsive to the environment. As conditions change, so do the traits that are favored, and populations track these changes through natural selection. The finches are adapting in real time to their changing world, just as Darwin imagined. Fish populations provide additional examples. In many lakes, guppies are preyed upon by pike, a voracious fish predator. In streams above waterfalls, where pike can't reach, guppies live without this predation pressure. Researchers have shown that guppies in high predation environments evolve different traits than guppies in low predation environments. When predators are abundant, guppies mature earlier and smaller, reproduce more frequently, and have more offspring per reproductive event. They also have less colourful males, because bright colours attract predators as well as mates. When predators are absent, guppies mature later and larger, reproduce less often, and males are more brightly coloured. The remarkable thing is that these differences evolve rapidly. Researchers have transplanted guppies from high predation to low predation environments and watched them evolve over just a few generations. Within a few years, the transplanted populations show measurable shifts in traits, moving toward the life histories typical of low predation populations. This is evolution in action, documented in natural populations under natural conditions. The environment changes, natural selection responds, and populations adapt. These examples, from moths to bacteria to finches to fish, demonstrate the power of natural selection. Given variation, differential survival and reproduction, and inheritance, populations evolve. They adapt to their environments, tracking changes, and responding to selection pressures. This is what Darwin predicted, and it's exactly what we observe. Evolution by natural selection isn't just a historical inference based on fossils and comparative anatomy. It's a process we can see happening, measure, and study in detail. It's as real and observable as any phenomenon in science. Speciation, the origin of species. Natural selection explains how populations adapt to their environments, how they change over time in response to selection pressures. But Darwin's book was titled On the Origin of Species, and a complete evolutionary theory must explain not just how existing species change, but how new species arise in the first place. How does one species split into two? How does the diversity of life, with millions of distinct species, arise from common ancestry? This is the question of speciation, one of the most active areas of research in evolutionary biology. The first challenge is defining what we mean by a species. This turns out to be more difficult than you might think. The most widely used definition is the biological species concept, proposed by Ernst Mayr in the 1940s. According to this definition, species are groups of populations whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but cannot successfully breed with members of other such groups. The key is reproductive isolation. If two populations can't exchange genes through reproduction, they're separate species. If they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they're the same species. This definition works well for many organisms, especially animals. Lions and tigers are separate species because, although they can sometimes produce hybrid offspring called ligers or tigons in captivity, these hybrids are often infertile or have reduced fitness, and lions and tigers don't interbreed in nature. Horses and donkeys are separate species because, although they can produce hybrid offspring called mules, mules are sterile and can't reproduce. The reproductive barrier defines the species boundary, but the biological species concept has limitations. It doesn't work for organisms that reproduce asexually, like many bacteria. It's difficult to apply to fossils, since we can't test whether extinct organisms could interbreed. And there are cases in nature where the boundaries between species are fuzzy. Some populations can interbreed where they meet, but are distinct in other ways. Ring species, where a chain of populations encircles a geographic barrier, and populations at the two ends can't interbreed, even though adjacent populations along the chain can challenge our neat categories. Despite these complications, the biological species concept provides a useful framework for thinking about speciation. If species are defined by reproductive isolation, then speciation is the evolution of reproductive barriers. How does this happen? The most straightforward scenario is allopatric speciation, where populations become geographically separated. Imagine a population of birds living in a forest. A mountain range rises, or a river changes course, dividing the forest in two. Now, there are two isolated populations that can no longer exchange genes. They're exposed to different environments, different selection pressures. In one region, the climate is wetter, in the other, drier. Different predators or competitors are present. Different food sources are available. Over time, the two populations diverge. Natural selection favors different traits in each population. Random mutations occur, and different mutations spread in each population through selection or drift. After enough time, the populations have accumulated so many differences that even if they come back into contact, they can no longer interbreed successfully. Reproductive barriers have evolved. These barriers might be prezygotic, preventing mating or fertilization in the first place. Perhaps the populations have evolved different mating displays or songs, so individuals don't recognize members of the other population as potential mates. Perhaps they mate at different times of year. Perhaps they're adapted to different habitats and rarely encounter each other. Or the barriers might be post-zygotic, reducing the fitness of hybrid offspring. Perhaps hybrids have genetic incompatibilities that reduce their survival. Perhaps hybrids are sterile, like mules. Perhaps hybrids are viable and fertile, but less fit in either parental environment, caught between the adaptations of their parents. In any case, the result is reproductive isolation. The two populations have become separate species, no longer able to exchange genes, free to continue diverging along independent evolutionary paths. Allopatric speciation is thought to be the most common mode of speciation, especially in animals. Geographic isolation provides the necessary reduction in gene flow that allows populations to diverge. Many of the examples we've discussed involve allopatric speciation. Darwin's finches arose when founding populations reached different islands in the Galápagos, then diverged in isolation. The diversity of mammals in Australia reflects millions of years of isolation on an island continent, with marsupials diversifying to fill ecological roles occupied by placental mammals on other continents. But speciation can also occur without complete geographic isolation. Sympatric speciation, where new species arise within the same geographic area, is more controversial, but does occur, especially in plants. The most common mechanism is polyploidy, the duplication of the entire genome. If a plant undergoes a mutation that causes its chromosomes to double, it becomes tetraploid, with 4 copies of each chromosome instead of 2. If this tetraploid individual mates with a normal diploid individual, the offspring are triploid and usually sterile because their chromosomes can't pair properly during meiosis. But if 2 tetraploid individuals mate, they can produce viable, fertile tetraploid offspring. Instantly, a new species has been created, reproductively isolated from the parental species by chromosome number differences. Polyploidy is extremely common in plants. It's estimated that between 40 and 70% of flowering plant species have polyploid ancestry. Many crop plants are polyploids. Wheat is hexaploid, with 6 copies of each chromosome. Strawberries are octoploid, with 8 copies. Polyploidy provides instant speciation, and can also provide raw material for evolution, because the extra gene copies can diverge and take on new functions. It's one reason why plant diversity is so high, and why plant evolution can happen relatively quickly. Sympatric speciation can also occur through other mechanisms. If a population exploits 2 different ecological niches, and individuals specialize on one niche or the other, divergent selection can drive the evolution of reproductive isolation. Imagine fish in a lake where food is available in 2 habitats, shallow shores and deep waters. Fish that specialize on shallow habitats and fish that specialize on deep habitats might evolve different body shapes, different feeding structures, and different behaviors. If they mate in their preferred habitat, they'll tend to mate with others of their type. Over time, this assortative mating can reinforce the split, eventually leading to reproductive isolation and the origin of 2 species from one, all within the same lake. There's evidence for this kind of ecological speciation in various organisms. Cichlid fish in African lakes have diversified into hundreds of species, often with multiple species arising within a single lake. Some eat algae, some eat insects, some eat other fish, and their jaw structures reflect these dietary specializations. Even though the fish are in the same lake and could potentially interbreed, they tend to mate with others that share their ecological niche, creating reproductive isolation. Similarly, apple maggot flies in North America originally bred on hawthorn trees. But about 150 years ago, some populations shifted to breeding on introduced apple trees. Now, there are 2 forms, one breeding on hawthorns and one on apples, and they've started to diverge genetically. They mate on the fruit of their host plant, so they rarely encounter each other. This is speciation in progress, driven by ecological divergence without geographic isolation. The speciation process is usually gradual. Reproductive isolation doesn't evolve all at once. It builds up step by step as populations diverge. At first, populations might be able to interbreed freely, producing fully viable and fertile offspring. As they diverge, maybe hybrids start to show reduced fitness. Maybe they're viable, but slightly less fit than non-hybrids. As divergence continues, maybe hybrids become sterile, or maybe mating becomes less successful. Eventually, if the process continues long enough, the populations become completely reproductively isolated, unable to exchange genes at all. This means there's a continuum from populations within a species that are slightly different to subspecies that are more distinct to fully separate species that are completely reproductively isolated. Where we draw the line is somewhat arbitrary. This can frustrate taxonomists who want clear boundaries, but it's exactly what we'd expect from evolution. Speciation is a process that takes time, and at any given moment, we might catch populations at intermediate stages. The time it takes for speciation to occur varies widely. In some cases, like polyploidy, a new species can arise in a single generation. In other cases, speciation might take thousands or millions of years. The rate depends on many factors: the strength of selection, the degree of geographic isolation, the generation time of the organism, the availability of genetic variation. But given enough time, speciation is inevitable. As populations diverge, they eventually reach a point where they can no longer interbreed. At that point, they're on separate evolutionary trajectories, free to continue diverging indefinitely. This process, repeated over and over across the tree of life, explains the diversity we see today. A single ancestral species splits into two. Each of those species can split again, and their descendants can split again. Over millions of years, a single lineage can give rise to dozens, hundreds, or thousands of species. This is adaptive radiation, the rapid diversification of a lineage into many species, adapted to different ecological niches. The mammals radiated after the extinction of the dinosaurs, diversifying into whales, bats, rodents, primates, and countless other forms. The finches radiated on the Galápagos, filling different niches on different islands. Understanding speciation helps us understand why there are so many species on Earth, why life is so diverse. It's not that each species was separately created, it's that species split and split again, like branches on a tree, producing the millions of species we see today from a single common ancestor billions of years ago. Every species alive today is the result of countless speciation events stretching back through deep time. We're all relatives, some close, some distant, united by the tree of life, the grand pattern of descent with modification that Darwin glimpsed and that evolutionary biology has confirmed. The universal acid. In 1995, philosopher Daniel Dennett published a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. In it, he argued that Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was more than just a biological theory. It was an idea so powerful, so corrosive to traditional ways of thinking, that it transformed everything it touched. Dennett compared Darwin's idea to a universal acid, a hypothetical substance so reactive that it would eat through any container, dissolving everything and transforming it in the process. The metaphor is apt. Darwin's idea has spread far beyond biology. It has influenced how we think about psychology, economics, culture, philosophy, even cosmology. Anywhere there's variation, selection, and a replication, evolutionary processes can operate. And once you see the world through an evolutionary lens, it becomes difficult to see it any other way. Traditional concepts, purpose, design, meaning, all look different when viewed from the perspective that life's complexity and apparent design arose through an undirected, algorithmic process. At its core, Darwin's dangerous idea is that design can emerge without a designer. This is what made it so revolutionary and so threatening to traditional worldviews. For centuries, complexity in nature was seen as evidence of divine creation. The intricate structure of an eye, the precise coordination of an ecosystem, the beauty of a flower, all were thought to require an intelligent designer. William Paley's watchmaker argument captured this intuition perfectly. If you find a watch lying on the ground, you infer that it must have been made by a watchmaker because its complexity and functionality couldn't arise by chance. By analogy, the complexity of living things implies a creator. Darwin's theory overturned this reasoning. It showed that complexity, adaptation, and apparent design could arise through a natural process requiring no foresight, no planning, no intelligence. Random variation, filtered by natural selection over vast stretches of time, could produce all the wonders of the biological world. The eye didn't require a designer. It evolved gradually, step by step, from simple light-sensitive patches to complex camera-like structures, with each intermediate form providing some advantage to its possessor. The complexity of ecosystems didn't require a planner. It emerged from the interactions of countless organisms, each pursuing its own survival and reproduction. This was dangerous, Dennett argued, because it challenged not just creationism, but any worldview that relied on top-down design or predetermined purposes. If life wasn't designed, then humans weren't designed. We're not here for any particular purpose. We're the product of a long series of accidents, chance mutations, and contingent historical events that could have turned out differently. Our existence isn't necessary or inevitable. It's just one outcome among countless possibilities in the vast space of potential evolutionary pathways. For many people, this is deeply unsettling. It seems to rob life of meaning, to reduce us to mere machines, the products of blind forces. But Dennett and others argue that this is a misunderstanding. Evolution doesn't rob life of meaning. It changes where meaning comes from. Meaning isn't handed down from above by a creator. It emerges from below, from our evolved capacities for consciousness, emotion, purpose, and choice. We create meaning through our actions, our relationships, our projects. The fact that we arose through natural processes rather than divine creation doesn't make our experiences less real, or our purposes less genuine. In fact, understanding our evolutionary origins can enrich our appreciation of life. Consider the immense improbability of your existence. You're here because an unbroken chain of ancestors, stretching back billions of years through countless generations, successfully survived and reproduced in an ever-changing world. You carry within you the legacy of that long history, encoded in your DNA, reflected in your anatomy and your behavior. You're connected to every other living thing through the tree of life, sharing genes with your fellow humans, with chimpanzees, with fish, with bacteria. You're made of stardust, atoms forged in the hearts of long-dead stars, organized through evolution into a conscious being capable of contemplating the universe. That's a profound and humbling thought. Darwin's idea has spread beyond biology because the same algorithmic process, variation, selection, and replication can operate in other domains. Consider cultural evolution. Ideas, technologies, and practices vary. Some spread and persist, others don't. This isn't random. Successful ideas spread because they're useful, appealing, or compatible with existing beliefs. They replicate as people adopt and transmit them. Over time, cultures evolve, accumulating knowledge and complexity through a process that has parallels to biological evolution. Richard Dawkins coined the term meme to describe units of cultural transmission that evolve like genes. Memes can be songs, fashions, techniques, stories, anything that spreads from person to person. Successful memes, those that are catchy, memorable, or useful, spread widely. Unsuccessful memes die out. The meme concept is controversial and has been criticized for being too simplistic, but it captures an important insight. Cultural change has evolutionary properties. It involves variation, competition, and selection. Understanding cultural evolution through an evolutionary lens can illuminate how languages change, how technologies improve, and how social norms develop. Economics has also been influenced by evolutionary thinking. Market economies involve competition among firms, variation in products and strategies, and selection through the success or failure of businesses. Profitable strategies spread as successful firms grow and others imitate them. Unprofitable strategies disappear as firms go bankrupt. This is an evolutionary process. While economic evolution differs from biological evolution in important ways, there's enough similarity that evolutionary models can provide insights into economic change. Even in cosmology, some scientists have proposed evolutionary mechanisms. Lee Smolin has suggested that universes might reproduce through black holes, with the physical constants of each universe subject to slight variation. If universes with certain properties are more likely to produce black holes, and thus more likely to reproduce, then over time the properties of universes might evolve to favor black hole production. This is speculative and controversial, but it shows how far Darwin's idea has reached. Anywhere there's variation, selection, and replication, evolutionary processes might operate. Dennett argues that Darwin's idea is universal in another sense too. It's a substrate-neutral algorithm, a process that can be implemented in any medium. Biological evolution operates on genes made of DNA, but the same principles could apply to information stored in different forms. This is relevant for understanding the origin of life, which might have involved evolution at the level of self-replicating molecules before DNA existed, and for thinking about artificial life and evolution in computers. Programmers have developed genetic algorithms that use evolutionary principles to solve problems. These algorithms create a population of potential solutions, evaluate their fitness, select the best performers, and create new variations through mutation and recombination. Over many generations, the population evolves toward better solutions. Genetic algorithms have been used to design antennas, optimize schedules, and evolve strategies for games. They demonstrate that evolution isn't tied to biology. It's a general process that emerges from the logic of variation, selection, and replication. This universality is what makes Darwin's idea so dangerous, in Dennett's sense. It's not just a theory about where species come from. It's a way of thinking about change, adaptation, and complexity that applies far beyond its original domain. Once you understand evolutionary thinking, you see it everywhere. You see how languages evolve, how technologies improve through incremental innovations, how ecosystems assemble themselves without central planning. You see that order and complexity can emerge from the bottom up through simple rules rather than being imposed from the top down by design. This has philosophical implications. It suggests that much of what seems designed, organized, or purposeful in the world might actually be the result of evolutionary processes. It challenges us to look for historical explanations, pathways of gradual change, rather than assuming that complexity requires a designer. It encourages us to think in terms of populations and probabilities, rather than essences and certainties. And it reminds us that we're part of nature, products of the same processes that shaped all life, rather than separate from or above the natural world. Darwin was cautious about applying his theory to humans. In The Origin of Species, he barely mentioned human evolution, noting only that light would be thrown on the origin of man and his history. He knew the implications would be controversial, but 12 years later, in The Descent of Man, he addressed human evolution directly, arguing that humans evolved from earlier primates and that many of our characteristics, including our moral sense and social behaviors, have evolutionary origins. This remains one of the most sensitive applications of evolutionary theory. The idea that humans evolved challenges religious beliefs that humans were specially created in the image of God. It suggests that human behavior, including aggression, cooperation, sexuality, and morality, can be studied scientifically as products of evolution. This raises difficult questions. If our behaviors have evolutionary origins, are we less responsible for them? If our moral sense evolved, is morality just a human invention rather than an absolute truth? These are profound philosophical issues that evolutionary thinking forces us to confront. But evolutionary explanations of human behavior needn't be reductive or deterministic. Saying that a behavior has evolutionary roots doesn't mean it's unchangeable or that it should be accepted. Evolution shaped our brains to be flexible, to learn, to be influenced by culture. Human nature isn't fixed. We're capable of enormous behavioral variation, of overriding instincts, of changing our societies and ourselves. Understanding our evolutionary heritage gives us insight into our psychology, but it doesn't constrain our choices. If anything, understanding our nature better equips us to shape our future. Darwin's dangerous idea continues to evolve, taking on new forms as science advances. Evolutionary theory today incorporates genetics, developmental biology, ecology, and behavior in ways Darwin never imagined. We understand mechanisms of evolution, from DNA mutations to gene regulation to epigenetic inheritance, that weren't known in Darwin's time. We can test evolutionary hypotheses with experiments and observe evolution in real time. We can reconstruct evolutionary history with molecular clocks and phylogenetics. The theory is far richer and more sophisticated than it was in 1859, but its core insight remains. Life's diversity and complexity arose through an undirected process of variation and selection, operating over deep time. This insight has been one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, comparable to the Copernican revolution that displaced Earth from the center of the universe, or the quantum revolution that revealed the strange nature of matter and energy at the smallest scales. Like those revolutions, Darwin's idea initially seemed strange and counterintuitive. It challenged cherished beliefs and comfortable assumptions. But like those revolutions, it has proven to be true, supported by overwhelming evidence, productive in generating new knowledge, and transformative in how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. The idea remains dangerous in the sense that it continues to challenge traditional ways of thinking. It suggests that humans aren't the pinnacle of creation, but one branch among millions on the tree of life. It implies that purpose and meaning aren't handed to us, but must be created by us. It reminds us that we're animals, products of evolution, with all that implies about our nature and our limitations. These ideas are uncomfortable for many people, and they continue to generate controversy and resistance. But Darwin's idea is also liberating. It connects us to the natural world, to the grand sweep of life's history, to every other living thing through bonds of kinship. It reveals a universe that's ancient, vast, and wondrous, operating through natural laws we can understand through science. It shows that complexity and beauty can arise through natural processes, that we don't need supernatural explanations for the diversity of life. And it gives us a framework for understanding not just biology, but change and adaptation in many domains. Darwin's dangerous idea is more than a theory. It's a way of seeing the world, one that has profoundly shaped modern thought and continues to illuminate the nature of life, including our own. As we continue to explore its implications and applications, we're still working through the revolution that Darwin began when he published The Origin of Species over a century and a half ago. The idea remains as powerful, as provocative, and as illuminating as ever, a testament to the power of careful observation, rigorous thinking, and the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads. A peaceful conclusion. We've travelled a long way tonight, from Victorian England to remote volcanic islands, from ancient fossils to living laboratories where evolution happens before our eyes. We've explored one of humanity's most profound ideas, the theory that all life on Earth, in all its staggering diversity, arose through the undirected process of natural selection, operating on random variation over billions of years. It's an idea that seems simple when stated simply, yet it explains the complexity and beauty of the natural world with elegant power. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection transformed biology and continues to shape how we understand life. Every field of biology, from genetics to ecology to developmental biology to medicine, is unified by evolutionary thinking. As the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky famously wrote, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. The patterns we observe in nature, the similarities and differences among species, the distribution of traits, the fossil record, the molecular evidence, all make sense when viewed through the lens of evolution. Without evolution, biology would be a disconnected collection of facts. With evolution, it becomes a coherent, predictive science. But beyond its scientific importance, evolution speaks to deeper questions about who we are and where we came from. We're not separate from nature, created by different means than other living things. We're part of the grand tapestry of life, related to every organism through common descent, carrying in our bodies the legacy of billions of years of evolutionary history. This is a humbling realization, but it's also awe-inspiring. We're the universe becoming aware of itself, matter organized through evolution into conscious beings capable of understanding our own origins. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming, drawn from multiple independent lines of inquiry that all point to the same conclusion. Fossils document the history of life and reveal transitional forms. Comparative anatomy shows the nested pattern of similarities and differences among species that reflects their evolutionary relationships. Molecular biology reveals that all life shares the same genetic code, and that DNA sequences record evolutionary history. Biogeography shows patterns of species distribution that make sense only in light of evolution. Direct observation documents evolution happening in real time, in bacteria, in moths, in finches, in countless other organisms. This convergence of evidence is what makes evolution one of the most solidly supported theories in science. It's not just one line of evidence that could potentially be explained away. It's multiple independent lines, all pointing in the same direction, like different roads, all leading to the same destination. The theory has been tested repeatedly and has passed every test. It makes predictions that have been confirmed. It explains phenomena that would otherwise be mysterious. It provides a framework that unifies biology and makes sense of life's diversity. Yet, despite this overwhelming evidence, evolution remains controversial in some quarters. This isn't because the science is uncertain. The scientific community has overwhelming consensus on the reality of evolution. The controversy is social and religious, stemming from the implications of evolution for human origins and for traditional religious beliefs. This is understandable. Evolution challenges beliefs that many people hold dear, particularly the belief that humans were specially created by God in His image and have a unique place in the cosmos. But there needn't be conflict between evolution and religion for those who choose not to see one. Many religious traditions have found ways to accommodate evolution, seeing it as the mechanism through which God creates. Evolution describes how life developed. It doesn't address why the universe exists or what ultimate meaning or purpose life might have. Those are questions beyond science, in the realm of philosophy and religion. Science and religion ask different questions and use different methods. They needn't be in opposition. What matters is that we follow the evidence honestly, wherever it leads, and that we're willing to adjust our beliefs in light of that evidence. This is the essence of scientific thinking, a willingness to question, to test, to revise our understanding based on what we observe. Darwin modeled this approach beautifully. He gathered evidence for decades before publishing, anticipated objections, acknowledged difficulties with his theory, and continually refined his ideas. His theory has been refined further in the century and a half since, incorporating new discoveries and new understanding. But its core insight remains valid and powerful. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can reflect on the deep time that stretches behind us, the countless generations of ancestors who struggled and succeeded and passed their genes to the next generation in an unbroken chain leading to you. Think about the processes: mutation, natural selection, genetic drift that shaped those ancestors, adapting them to changing environments, producing the incredible diversity of life we see today. Think about your connections to all living things, the genes you share with your fellow humans, with other primates, with all mammals, with all vertebrates, with all life. You are the product of evolution, but you're also more than that. You're a conscious being, capable of understanding the process that created you, capable of wonder and curiosity, capable of shaping your own future. Evolution gave you your body and brain, but you give yourself your purposes and meanings. You're part of the natural world, but also capable of transcending your evolutionary heritage through culture, technology, and conscious choice. That's the paradox and the promise of being human in an evolved world. Darwin's dangerous idea has changed how we see ourselves and our world. It has unified biology, inspired new technologies, and deepened our understanding of life. It has challenged traditional beliefs and forced us to grapple with profound questions about purpose, meaning, and our place in the cosmos. But at its heart, it's a story about the power of patient observation, rigorous thinking, and the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads. It's a story about the creativity of nature, the elegance of simple rules, operating over vast time to produce complexity and beauty. And it's a story about connection, the deep kinship that unites all life in a single grand tree of descent with modification. So rest easy tonight, knowing that you're part of something vast and ancient and wonderful. The same forces that shaped the eye of a trilobite 500 million years ago and the wing of a bird 150 million years ago shaped you. The same genetic code that directs the growth of a redwood tree directs your own development. You are a brief moment in a vast process, but in that moment, you have the capacity to understand, to appreciate, to wonder. That's the gift that evolution has given us: consciousness and curiosity, and the ability to comprehend our own origins. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of science's greatest ideas. If you enjoyed this exploration of Darwin's dangerous idea and the theory of evolution by natural selection, please give this video a like. Subscribe to Bedtime Biology for more calming explorations of the natural world, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what aspect of evolution you find most fascinating. Until next time, sleep well, dream of deep time and distant ancestors, and remember that in understanding evolution, we're understanding the story of life itself, including our own.